Hi, I'm Karen Dillon. I'm the co-author of The Microstress Effect, How Little Things Pile Up and Create Big Problems and What to Do About It. And one of the best pieces of advice I was ever given was before eating really, really spicy food, line your stomach with milk and grease, milk and French fries. You will survive the meal. You will save your dignity if you line your stomach with really greasy, fat foods and milk. And that served me very well in a work outing.
Oh, that's awesome. So how do you do that though at a Mexican restaurant, Karen? Do they
Well,
serve? Do they give you something or what?
you can
Brings
ask
her
for a
own.
glass of milk. You can ask for tortillas that are fried. In my particular case, in Boston, there used to be a restaurant called the East Coast Grill, which twice a year had something they called Hell Night, where they put their spiciest, hottest food in. There used to be something called Pasta from Hell that you had to sign a waiver to have. And I was taken there on kind of an alpha male outing with some of my colleagues, and everyone was going to be really macho about how much hot, spicy food they can eat. And my husband gave me the advice before I left. He's from the UK and he's eaten a lot of Indian food. Line your stomach. And I did. I got a glass of milk. Everybody else ordered beer. I had a big glass of milk, which they had, and French fries, which some reason they had that night too. And that served me really well. I was able to eat the meal with dignity and maybe even endure a little bit more than some of my male colleagues.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that. I love that. So, Rob, you've got some good advice for us too?
So Rob Cross, co-author of the Microstress Effect as well, and I'm apparently the boring one of the two of us. As I thought about this, my best advice was actually pretty serious, and it was going into a PhD program. And one of the advisors that I had said, every day is a writing day. Right? And that meant every day you wake up and you do, whether it's 5 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it is, you chip away at what you're trying to get done. And that really sat with me. And I'll tell you, the funny thing for me now at this stage of my life is I hear people that talk about how they're going to retire and go write a novel, getting a cottage beside Walden Pond or something like that for 2 months. And I keep saying that's not how it happens, right? It's all in the small moments that you're persistent on. And it actually has played out into a ton of other dimensions of my life, right? The small moments, and it'll play out in some of the advice that we talk about here as we go. So not quite as good as fiery food, but
No, but
It's really good advice, though.
That's awesome. So, well, I know Seth Godin writes every day. Anthony Anarino writes every day. I try to write. I probably write 4 or 5 days a week. Rob, do you write every day?
I do. I do it. And it's a discipline that's translated into a lot of things in my life, whether it's exercise. I'm just starting to play a musical instrument. You laugh at this. I got a mandolin right behind me. And I'm just getting 5-10 minutes in, small moments and persistence. And it's a key lesson from this book. And I hate to translate into that so quickly, but what we find is it's the small moments that matter, that most of us don't manage too well. And your question made me reflect on that and kind of how it's played out in my life. So thank you.
Awesome. Good. Yeah. Well, so the Microstress Effect, awesome book. So I love that, right? The little things. So microstress. So Karen, I'm going to start with you here. How do you define a microstress?
Well, we define it as small moments of stress that are created in everyday interactions with people that you're close to, personally and professionally, that are so small and happen so quickly that you literally barely register that they happen, but whose cumulative effect is enormous. So microstress happens and you almost don't notice it, but it's building up and building up all day, all week, all month.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So you almost don't notice it. So Rob, how did you notice this? How did you decide that this was something that you need to write a book about?
Yeah, great question. So we actually weren't looking for it. It seems like every good idea, that's come out of research in my life has been not what I initially went in. And several years ago, the consortium members were saying, we really want to understand how relationships in people's lives affect their well-being. And there's a lot of books that were starting to come out saying if you, for example, lose quality connections and you fall into categories of loneliness, that's the equivalent mortality rate of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I mean, there's a ton of bad things that happen without these connections. And so where we were really going, though, I mean, the problem with all that is that most of the advice kind of comes down to you need 2 best friends, right? And that's a really hard thing to just go out and find 2 best friends, right? The studies say it takes 200 hours to move from an acquaintance to a best friend. There's a lot of challenges to that. And so what we were focused on is what are the reasonable ways that relationships could have a positive impact on our well-being. And we were looking at how connections in our life affect our physical health, affect our growth in and out of work, affect our purpose in life and purpose and meaning, and affect resilience, right? And very specifically, not on what the people were doing, but the role of the connections around the people that were creating that or diminishing it. And it just happened in the first interview, majestic interview, wonderful story of a woman that just shifted her life completely in certain ways. It was a product of becoming more physically healthy, becoming a marathon runner, probably saving her life in some ways. And it was a product of the people that she connected into that made the difference. And so it was a wonderful interview. Kind of midway through, we just stopped and said, well, what got you in trouble to begin with? You're a brilliant woman, right? Clearly goal-oriented. And yet you'd fallen into this trap around your own well-being, the physical component at this point. And the reaction was so poignant. We went from an interview that was 100 miles a minute, everything is great, down to 60 seconds of silence, and her just looking, and finally said something like, just life, I guess, or I don't know. And of course, that got really interesting to say, well, what is it that sneaks up on really bright people, right? And really thoughtful people and really motivated people. And we kind of dived into, well, what does a day look like, right? Where all the stresses, the small stresses are coming from. And then what does a week and what does a month look like? And we persisted that across hundreds of interviews. And it really led us to see that certainly the big stresses are happening in people's lives. And there's disassociated stress, like the war in the Ukraine, the economy, social justice. But the thing that's unrecognized that is having a really massive and negative impact on people are the stress that's created in the relationships in our lives and the speed with which those kinds of small moments of stress are coming at us day in and day out, given how hyper-connected we are. So that was the backstory of it.
Wow, that's interesting, right? We have it all together on the macro level, and then in the micro level, it gets us. So,
yeah, and I will say something just off of that for a second. All these people, great organizations, very successful people. That's how we got to them, right? 5 women, 5 men in each of these organizations. And what was fascinating is every one of them, I would say, the first 10 minutes were rainbows and lollipops, right? It's all great, right? And then you kind of slowly peel it back and you start seeing, and they start seeing, the degree to which the stresses are hitting them in different ways, professionally and personally. We had some subset that were literally choking out by the end of it. You got a clear picture where 90% of the population was really struggling to hold it together, like looking at what balls do I drop, not how do I excel in certain ways. And that gets really pointed. I mean, that gets in your soul after a while. You have those number of conversations with people that you probably only talk with 4 or 5 times, in your life. And so it got super meaningful to both of us, on a personal level too, as we went.
I can only imagine. I mean, that is super deep and yet super, like, as you mentioned, not talked about. So Karen, how do we even identify those micro stressors? Is there something in our life that says, oh yeah, this is a micro stressor, or is it like a series of things and then it comes to a head, or what did you find in the research?
So we put the forms of microstress into 3 buckets, but I'll give you sort of a headline to think about first. If you find yourself kind of constantly in reactive posture, you're just reacting to things. You're never able to shape your day, shape your interaction. You open your email in the beginning of the morning and you already feel like you're behind for the day. You're probably facing a sort of flood of microstress. But we put them into 3 big buckets, and you'll recognize, I think, all three categories. The first are microstresses that drain your capacity to get things done. The things that just creep into your day that mean you're never on top of things. You're always chasing something. You're always responding to something. It could be something like unpredictable behavior from a person in authority. You're not a jerk, not a toxic person, but your manager, your boss kind of shifts what he's asking of you, from 1 minute to the next. I used to have a boss that enthusiastically would stop me in the hallway with another idea, a brainstorm. And it took me a while to figure out that was kind of part of his creativity, but it wasn't necessarily like a mandate to do something, but I never quite knew. It took me a long time to get there. Or if you were just working hard, we're all going 100 miles an hour, and you find you're sort of into a joint project, a collaborative project, and you're misaligned in some way with one of the colleagues that you're working with. It'll take you some time to figure it out, to correct it, to get back on the same page. So the point is, these are routine interactions that are just a byproduct of how busy and, as Rob said, hyper-connected we are, that just can creep into our ability to get things done. Happen at work, and then we take it home, and then they happen at home as well. So surges in responsibilities, small things. Point is, not toxic people, routine things. Second category are microstresses that deplete your emotional reserves. Again, not absolute jerks in your life, but just the routine interactions you have. One of my favorite examples, because I think a lot of us relate to this, is leaving your house in a hurry in the morning, and just the way you and your spouse or you and your kids interact is not the best version of you. You snipe at each other. You have curt words over some kind of an inconsequential chore. That stays with you all day. You've got, again, just a little depletion in your emotional reserves. It's not, your marriage is not in trouble. Your kids still love you. You still love them. But that's kind of the beginning of your day, and that the ripple effects of having your emotional reserves sort of depleted, or feeling like you work. We all had this too. You work with colleagues where there's someone who's just spraying stress all over the place. It's not your stress, but they make it your stress by spraying it on you. We call it secondhand stress. That can take a really significant toll on you. So again, routine interactions, they happen quickly. They're in your brain, but your body's responding to it, but you don't fully know that it happened, or you don't quite register. And then the third category are microstresses that challenge your identity. These are subtle, and they may be the least of the three categories that you would recognize, but things that kind of maybe are pressuring you to pursue goals that are out of your sense of self. For example, if you work for a really high pressure sales organization, you might value your relationship with your clients, and you have really good, strong relationship. And then you have a boss who wants you to do something with someone in the book. The boss today is dialing for dollars. And there was like an aggressive push to kind of push a new product or service on the clients. It wasn't who they wanted to be, nothing unethical. It was, it was just selling a product. It wasn't cheating them, but I'm not that person. Or a common example were sort of people who are medical professionals who just feel that the way their day goes, that the speed at which they can. I have a friend who's a doctor, I think, who's like, they have 15 minutes or 7 minutes to see patients. That's not the doctor I want to be. It's, again, nothing wrong. You're genuinely seeing me. I'm giving you my attention, but only for that brief period of time. All of those forms of microstress challenge your ability to get things done. The emotional reserves you start your day with get depleted as you go along. And then the ones that challenge your sense of identity are even a little more troubling and profound. They're just worked into routine days.
Wow. So depleting our emotional reserves, draining our capacity to get things done, and challenging our identity. I can absolutely see, how those can be so stressful, especially the identity one, because who we are is really hard to change. And when we feel people that are tugging at that, I think that really challenges a lot. So is there one, Rob, that's more important or less important, or are they all equally important?
Yeah, I think they're going to play out differently for different people. But I do think as you go down that list from drain capacity to emotion to identity, they get progressively deeper, right, and harder to spot. And what troubled me in a lot of this is many people, probably 95% of our interviews could recount, instances of 3, 5, 8 years of their life where they were investing heavily into some system, right, whether it may be around certain sales results or delivering products on time or consulting projects or whatever it may be, only to wake up one day and go, I'm not, who I wanted to be, and these kind of stark wake up moments of pulling into a garage and sitting there for an hour, or, having your mother die and going to the funeral and nobody else showed up where you thought you had friends. I mean, these are real stories over and over and over again. And a lot of that comes from the more subtle ones around challenges to identity, and so as Karen was describing, there are some that kind of chip away as a product of the pushes that are happening slowly. And it also is a product of how we view ourselves as parents, right? Or as children, right? Or as siblings as well, that comes into play. But there's also shifts in the way in which our network reinforces our identity, right? And so a lot of times we would find people struggle. They would take a job in a different city or accept an immediate promotion. And they would be excited, right? Because that's what society tells us is great. We get more money, it's prestige, we're doing what we should be. And they would not recognize the degree to which that step was going to take them out of communities and connections that were making them whole as human beings to begin with. And so it's not uncommon to hear people say, come home with a promotion or a transition like that and say, you're not going to see me for the next year or whatever it is, right? And it was just immediately like, I'm going to give up, and I know I'm going to have to focus on getting good in this role. And the idea behind all that was in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it was, I'm going to get back into my tennis group, right? Or my singing group or poetry or book clubs or whatever it was. And the problem is most people didn't, right? And so you'd watch these people as time went on, and the connections around them were shifting, right? And the things that reinforced who they were as a runner, as a cook, as an intellectual in the book club, as those things went away, then that also, started to kind of chip away at their identity. And to us, the stories that ended the worst were those people that just slowly became entirely about their profession and direct family. And they would justify overworking in their profession as a provider. And that's a noble thing, but that's a never ending goal, right? And that was the problem, is when it becomes this never ending goal, that people would just kind of slowly lose everything. So I don't mean to sound so dire, because the solutions were actually quite easy for a lot of people, even when they fell into this position. But I do say it, kind of seriously, because I was surprised how many people resonate with that. You know what I mean? It's these slow moves that I'm making that are affecting the degree to which I have a sense of purpose, right, and meaning, and that sort of thing in my life.
Wow. Well, before we dive into some of the solutions, Karen, it looks like you've got something a little bit more that you want to add on that, because that's super important as we set this up and go to solutions. So what would you like to add to what Rob said?
That's really funny. I did, but then I thought it was my turn. I just was going to sort of explain a little bit more about what Rob talked about. I think is that for so many of us, we become narrower versions of ourselves as kind of each decade goes by. And you suddenly, in your 20s, we're, just out of college, we have lots of friends, lots of activities. The vibrant version of ourselves, maybe that we like most, at least personally outside of work, is the person in our 20s. But as we kind of focus on career and put our heads down and then focusing on our family, what happens is we kind of hive off some of those activities that made us, that made me. And we let those go by the wayside. And as our life gets narrower, we lose what we'll talk about in a minute, but one of the most important antidotes to microstress. But it's just sort of sad, and we all do it. We all put our heads down and go towards that one goal. But what gets lost in the process actually is something really powerful and really important. So just explaining it kind of creeps up on you decade by decade in your life.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because sometimes that awakening then ends up causing a crisis, right? So let's head that crisis off. Hopefully we can get that started earlier. So what are some of the solutions? You mentioned hopefully that are they simple, or are they easy, or are they both?
I think both, to be really honest. I mean, I believe they're simple. I don't believe we're good at it as human beings. Let me say that, because I think the ability to shape the interactions in our lives and remove some of the negative impact. If you start focusing not on how do I dump Uncle Joe out of my group, or my boss that's driving me crazy, and go and complain to everybody about them, but you hone in on the interactions that are creating stress around you, and be really mindful about not thinking about just the negative people, because actually the biggest forms of stress for most people are people we love and care about, right? Either people on our team we're worried about, siblings, others. As we put this Microstress Effect app out there, that is the top microstress, right? It's interactions with family and friends that can be either negative, draining, whatever it may be. And you need to look for opportunities to shift those interactions. I'll give you a very quick story for myself. I have a daughter that's a very high-end tennis player, and I used to chase her around the country in her juniors to tournaments all around the country. And we just fell into a pattern over time of her relying on me when anything went wrong, right? And it was needed at a certain point in time, but then that pattern persisted over time into her adult years. And it just went on where if anything was going negative in her life, it could be a 2-second thing, but she'd just fire me a text. And I'd get 3 or 4 of these things a day. And to her, it was just a knee-jerk reaction. It meant absolutely nothing. It was just kind of writing Baldy, here's, something to pass on. But to me, I'd think about it for 3-4 hours, right in the back of my head, just like Karen's saying, not fight or flight response, not panicking, in the back of my mind, along with 20 other things that have hit me in different ways through the day. And one day we discovered that's all she was doing, was just a knee-jerk reaction. She didn't even need to pass it on to me. So I said, well, stop, you're killing me. And she did, and she kind of knows when something's really wrong. I write Dad, and I'm there in a heartbeat. But filtering that out and not passing that on has had a material impact on my life, right? And in a way that didn't affect the relationship. What we find is if you start looking at your life that way and say, what are the interactions that I want to shield from a little bit that are creating one or another form of these 14 microstresses, you have a lot more opportunity than we think about. And it's really worth doing. We know in general, the negative interactions have about 3 to 5 times the impact of the positives in our lives. So if we're just doing things from a well-being standpoint, like meditation, mindfulness, gratitude, all those are great things. But if that's all we're doing, we're not saying, well, how do we actually shift the context that we're in? We're actually leaving really high leverage stuff on the table that could have an impact on our well-being. So that's not hard, right? but it requires us to think about and do something about it, in the context. And I'd say the same thing on the positives, but I'll pass that one to Karen. Maybe have Karen talk a little bit about the small moments that create, the positive, more vibrant life as well, because it's the same kind of notion of intentionality that plays out.
Sure. So we found in our research, there was a subset that actually handled microstress better than the rest of us. They probably had as much or more than we all do, but they actually just seemed to be able to rise above it and did not let it derail them in the way that the first interview Rob talked about, the woman who'd gotten really off track in her life. And we started calling them the 10 percenters because they were roughly 10% of our interviewees. And again, everybody in our research were high performers, people who were designated by the organizations as high performers. So everybody looked good on paper, but then we found the vast majority were really struggling with microstress. But these 10 percenters did a few things better than the rest of us. And one of the really significant things that they did was they actually found ways to form 2 or 3 sort of outside interest groups and activities that formed authentic connections with other people that made, we talked about life not getting too narrow, made their life that multidimensional life that was a better version of themselves. And the key was that they made time in their life for this, not necessarily in giant moments. They weren't all, running marathons to raise $1 million for charity or doing really sort of setting up huge political organization groups in their town. They were able to make these authentic connections with people through a common shared interest in an activity or pursuit or passion in some way, even in small moments. And one of the bits of advice one of our 10 percenters gave that I thought was so great was he worked really, very, very successful guy by anybody's measure, but he worked really hard at saying respectful no's so that he could make time or have time in his schedule for spontaneous, enthusiastic yeses. So they were able to just work into routine interactions in their day, save a little bit of time, or do some various techniques that help them get back into the best version of themselves. Sometimes sort of reclaiming a passion they had let go by the wayside as a way of rejuvenating something they once loved, but with new connections and with new people. One of our favorite examples from this is a guy in our research who was a really successful neurosurgeon, top neurosurgeon at a top organization. And his life had gotten narrow. And he found himself standing in a music store, picking up sheet music, I think, and seeing an ad for looking for guitar players. And this guy had been a guitar player back in his youth, but he's, long past that. But it said something like, what we lack in skill, we make up for in volume. And he answered the ad. And he found himself rocking out with these 20-somethings. Again, they weren't best friends, but it was a way to make a really good, authentic connection with a different group of people that just helps keep microstress in perspective. It creates other ways to see the world. It makes your problems kind of pale in comparison sometimes. And it just creates the vibrance of being connected to other human beings. So the small connections, small moments played a really big role in keeping those 10 percenters above the rest.
And that's what we've lost a lot of, right, through COVID. We've gone through this experience where we've moved, our work is more fractured. So we've moved from 1-hour meetings to 30-minute meetings, right? We have more volumes of these interactions in our lives, both personally and professionally. They're happening at a pace, volume, and diversity we've never experienced before. So we have more opportunities for these small moments of stress to be accelerating on us. And at the exact same time, the social distancing pulled us out of these groups, these interactions that created perspective, right, for us. And so if you find yourself, in that situation, there are kind of 3 great strategies that we see a lot of people do. One is what Karen said, is pick a passion from the past and use that to slingshot forward, right, into some new group. Number 2 is to rejuvenate connections from the past. Both Karen and I, in different ways, we take our own medicine in all of this, and we've kind of done different things that have reached back to relationships from the past and found things that rejuvenated those and pull them forward in different ways. And then the third is to really look carefully at how do you shift things that you're already doing and actually use those same activities, whether they're at work or outside of work, to pull into some relationships that you find meaningful. So one of our favorite stories is a very successful runner that, after 40 years of running for personal best time, she woke up one day and said, that's not what I want to be using running for. I want to run with my daughter, her best friend, and the best friend's parent, and it evolved into a community group. So she went from somebody that wasn't challenging 10K races for top spot, right? But she said she'd never been happier with what running was about for her, right? It wasn't society's definition of what good was. It was, let's use this activity and use it to pull me into 2 groups that give me a sense of purpose and meaning. When you again start looking at it that way, everybody can do that. You know what I mean? We can look at the things we're doing and saying, how do we pivot that a little bit?
So How do we help people though who don't see that this microstress is getting them? I know someone in particular that I know. She says she doesn't want relationships. She doesn't want to be pulled in those directions. She just wants to focus in on work. How do we help them see the light that maybe these microstressors really are kind of holding them back and stressing them out?
Yeah. I mean, I was really, oh, I'm sorry, Karen, you go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was taken, I'll say this quickly and then pass it back to Karen. I was taken by all the research that was out there, in addition to going through all these interviews. And you just know, again, the stories that were just really not good. These people would end and they'd left a trail of destruction. They were conventionally successful, right? Wealthy, probably beyond measure. But they'd been through several divorces, children that didn't talk to them, health that was beyond repair. And one of the craziest things to me is many of them would say some variant of, oh, I'd do it all again. It's been hard, but I'd do it all again. And yeah, same thing. My eyes would kind of pop out. I never said anything. I just kind of nodded and listened. But I think it's because they never really knew what could have been, right? They lock themselves in, they become narrower and narrower versions. And I think that kind of experimentation is why I've got a mandolin behind me. I have no idea where that'll take me, but we're going to try it, and see if that kind of pulls into a certain sphere of life there, because, it opens up doors. So I think that's one thing, I would encourage, is the more you can help people reflect a little bit on what are you giving up. And then the other thing I was going to say, and then let me hand it to Karen, I just was taken by all the research on this. When you actually look at all the data from the public health studies that have been done around loneliness, around the negative relationships, and the effect it's having on our physical health, on our mental well-being, what is really struck me is that we will chase blood pressure or cholesterol medicines down, and yet we're ignoring something that has the equivalent or greater effect on our health in different ways. And it really got in my bones, if you will, that people need to kind of think about and do something about it.
I'll just add to the research, because Rob usually cites this, but I think it's really worth pointing out, is his research suggests from Vivek Murthy, who's our current U.S. Surgeon General, that loneliness can have the same effect on mortality rates as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. This isn't just kind of a feeling, a vibe. This is really physiologically taking a significant toll on us, the microstress itself, and sort of the smaller and more narrow our lives become. So it's a really significant thing. And so for your friend who's not interested in this, she's probably interested in her own health and her own energy and her own ability to kind of persist through challenges. The thing I would add to that is, just to reinforce and point out, the impact of removing a negative is really significant. We have years of social science research that tells us that a negative interaction can have up to 5 times the impact of a positive one. So removing a negative one can have up to 5 times the impact of adding a positive. So when we start talking about meditation and mindfulness and things like that, which again are good things, we don't know, they're not bad things to do, but adding those things is towards the goal of just being stronger to deal with more and more stress, right? To find some inner grit, to what doesn't kill me makes me stronger kind of thing. If you think about removing several, 2, 3 negative interactions that are systemically in your life, happening routinely, that can have a really big impact on you. So maybe she can start with removing a few of the negatives, and then realizing that in some very small moments of connection, she can add those sort of positive inoculations to microstress.
That's encouraging. That's good, right? So remove some of the negative, then inoculate with some positive. I think that's good encouragement for folks. So if we are going to get started on this journey, because having read the book, I'm like, wow, like there's a lot here. I love that every chapter, has some meat as well as a break that I can do, that there's a lot of activity on that so that I can actually put this into practice, because a lot of times, right, we read these books and they're 700 pages. This one's only 200, which I love, right? It's short. It gets
that was actually hard to do. Yeah.
Yes.
That's harder. That is harder.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's two things that immediately popped to mind. One is we've also put this into an app, at least a small piece of it, a component of it, into an app that we've made available on the store for free, and so people can kind of download it and get a sense at least of the microstresses. It's not going to kind of cover the book in its entirety, but it'll kind of be one easier version to kind of go through a little bit. The thing I always encourage people to look at is that chapter 5. And there's a table in there where we're talking about the 14 microstresses. down one column, and then the next columns are talking about what are the sources of these in your life. And so it's, a boss, colleagues, team members, loved ones, it goes across the common sources of stress. And what we do, and we do this an awful lot live with groups too, is we ask people to go through this in 3 waves. First wave is to say, where are 2 or 3 of these that are systemic enough in your life that you should be doing something about it, right? And so it would be my example with my daughter, right? And saying, this is pervasive, it's happening, it's easy to fix, I can correct it. And, and get 3 or 4 of them in, put X's in 3 or 4 of those boxes. Many people will try to go to 10 to 15. You're like, no, because if it's everything, it's nothing. Keep it down to 3 or 4 that you'd actually go do something about. And the impact is great, right? Because of the effect of the negative over the positive, right? Second pass, you go through that same grid again, give us a few more minutes. I usually use 90 seconds when I'm with audiences, and say, where are 2 or 3 or 4 of these that you're unnecessarily causing others, right? And when we actually poll large groups, what you find, thousands of groups on WebEx or things like that with the webinars, the profile of microstresses that people are experiencing tend to mirror almost identically the ones they say they think that are passing on. Right. And so culturally, what you want to do is say, how do you stop this, in different ways? But it also matters for our own well-being in the sense of we know that the stress we create for others unnecessarily almost always boomerangs back on us in a different form. So you lean on a star employee too much and they start to burn out or pull away or potentially leave, and that creates more work. It gets less innovation from there. You push a child just a bit too far on something in the scope of things, it just doesn't matter. But it's in your head and you've gotten, into a battle over it, and you walk away with maybe a little more belligerence or a little distance relationship that creates stress. So that's the second pass, is what are you causing? Then the third pass is what do you need to rise above? And most people have had experiences in their life where they go through and they're muttering and just life is crazy and this person's driving me crazy. I wish I'd never had children, whatever it may be, right? You're driving in that way, and then something legitimately traumatic happens, right? You get a health diagnosis, a death in the family, something that's truly, legitimately impactful in your life. And you look back on those last 10 seconds and go, why did I care, right? Why was I in that frenzy? And really at the heart of it, that's what we found our 10 percenters did without the trauma. They just kind of lived above it at a certain level. And that's where having at least 2 and usually 3 of these groups you're an authentic part of really matters. Right? So it's not like a Anthony Robbins kind of, we're all great, all good. It's that you have dimensionality in your life that's kind of creating a perspective that says, some of this just doesn't matter. And that turns out to be really critical today. There's going to be so much of this hitting us. There's no real end in sight. If anything, it's probably moving in a worse direction. That there's so much you can deal with. And then some of it, you just have to live your own life and not get sucked into other people's idea of fun. And that's one strategy, right? At least 2 and usually 3 groups outside of your profession. So that's real easy to do. That's 15 minutes. You know what I mean? You go through that, you be systematic. You say, where's some of these things that I can pivot on? And it has it can have a very, very material effect on you very quickly.
Wow. Good stuff. Well, Kieran, from there, what would be your last piece of advice here? Folks are feeling the stress. They're feeling these microstresses, and they're like, okay, I got to do something here beyond what Rob said, or maybe even reinforce something that he said. What would you suggest?
I just sort of want to say to people, it's not your fault. Like, it's happening to all of us. It's the way we're connected, the way we work. It's coming at us 100 miles an hour. So sort of validating that you may be tired and this is frying you, but you haven't had the language to talk about it before. So hopefully we've given you a way to actually articulate something significant that is happening to you, because if you can name it, you can claim it. If you can actually sort of start to identify sources that are persistent, that are systemic, I really think just changing a couple things can make a big difference. Rob joking about his daughter and changing the interaction. They have a wonderful relationship, but that one thing, who hasn't looked down at a text in the middle of the day that's a little bit vague, and you start worrying about all spiraling through what's going on with your kids, with your spouse, with a friend. You can change the interactions in some small way that are going to take some of that microstress away, and it'll just kind of keep you closer to being on that plane that our 10 percenters live on.
Awesome. Love that. Love that. So, friends, if you're listening, if you're watching, get a copy of The Microstress Effect by Rob Cross and Karen Dillon. The book is fantastic. I encourage you to get a copy of it. I encourage you to download the app. While in between some stuff, I went and downloaded it. Super simple and yet super powerful. So I love that. Is there a website where folks can go to get some more information about all of this? We'll share that with folks.
Sure, sure. So we each have a personal website. Mine is robcross.org, and we've created a book page behind that. We've had a tremendous number of reviews and other things like that. And we've also put videos and other materials that support the book out there as well. So that's one resource. And then Karen has a website as well.
Yeah, I have a website, karendillon.net, but the book resources really are all on robcross.org, and it's a great sort of starting point. I think you can see little videos, you can see sort of examples of the different microstresses. So hopefully it will be a good starting point for someone who wants to go a little bit deeper.
Awesome. So friends, you want to get more, go to robcross.org, check out the resources there, get to know Rob and Karen. They've got lots of great stuff. And as Karen said, and this is a great way to take us out, friends, it's not your fault. You probably didn't know about it. You probably didn't think it was a thing. So get a copy of the book and take control before microstresses take control of you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Karen. Appreciate you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you.